It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, Aisha Ahmad. Aisha is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto and affiliate of the Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs. She was formerly a fellow at the Belfer Center on Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School. Aisha, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you please share with us your principal findings from Jihad & Co.? What assumptions about terrorism and insurgency do you challenge in your book?
Well, what I think is really important for us to reflect on is the fact that when we look at these jihadist groups that have emerged in civil wars across the world, whether Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Mali, we often look at this phenomenon and we think that it is primarily driven by ideology, fervent beliefs, identity politics, and that's a pretty understandable assumption because these groups say a lot of very inflammatory things. They certainly seem to be motivated by those sorts of belief systems. But the fact is, you can't win wars on ideology alone. Just deeply passionate beliefs do not pay for the bullet that goes into the gun, that does not feed your foot soldiers. And so at the end of the day, any groups that come to power in places like this have to have the resources to be able to do so. And a lot of the political economy explanations that are dominant in the literature primarily look at sources that come from the outside. Foreign governments that are sponsoring these groups, maybe some individuals in the deserts that may be inspired to send off some money. But we also know that money coming from the outside doesn't do the job of winning wars either. If that was the case, then the hundreds of billions of dollars that we have spent trying to create order in these places would have actually paid off differently than we've imagined. And so what my book does is it identifies what has up until this point been a somewhat hidden relationship between the clandestine business class, between local business elites and Islamists in these places, and it identifies a very rational, practical, economic reason why the business class might find itself in bed with ideologically motivated Islamists, which is a strange marriage because the business class is interested in profits, not in ideology. And yet what I find in my book is that what Islamists can do for the business class, which other armed groups can't do, is offer them something that they really desperately need, which is to lower their costs of doing business in a situation that is anarchic. And for that reason, there is a very local economic explanation for the reason that Islamists are able to compete well in these civil wars. And that really challenges our understanding of why these groups gain traction. So let me, for example, first lay out the way that these environments look to a business person. Say I want to sell a roll of fabric, and I'd like to sell it from my town all the way into an inland market. But, my country is at war with itself. My identity-based group, my ethnic group, my tribal group is at war with yours and yours and yours. And so in order for me to sell my goods into that inland market, it's not a simple situation of me being able to move goods through different rival territories. Now, even to sell in my territory, I need to pay off the guy who's in charge of my turf, my local strongman who is responsible for my ethnic or tribal community. That essentially constructs the tax that I must pay within my own territory. But say I dare to, there's a gentleman sitting further to the back. Say you and I want to make a deal with each other to sell in your territory. Now, our rival groups, our ethnic groups are maybe at war with each other, and so I can't just pay into your warlord's protection racket. You're going to have to buy security from him as well. And so we're now paying a taxation rate to my local warlord and then your local warlord as well. Next thing you know, we're paying twice as much. But to get to your territory, we have to pass through two different turfs in order to get there. And so the next thing you know, we're paying 2 times, 3 times, 4 times the amount of taxes just to be able to sell in that inland market. Ethnic and tribal fragmentation is expensive for the business class. It is costly, it is frustrating. By the time we are moving our goods into that inland market, I'm annoyed, you're annoyed, we're all annoyed, no one's buying anymore, everybody is frustrated. And herein is where the business community can do something remarkable, and that is that they can vote with their dollar. And the only groups that can really offer them in these contexts the ability to lower their costs are the Islamists. Because while I can only buy into my ethnic warlord protection racket, and you from yours, and you from yours, and you from yours, what the Islamists can do is they can show up and they can offer us all a discount. We can all buy into their protection racket. And by offering their protection services across ethnic and tribal divisions, they can lower the cost of doing business for all of us. It's a one-stop shop for protection services. And that, for the business community that is frustrated and annoyed with fragmentation, is a relief. It lowers costs for them, it gives them the ability to simplify and reduce their costs, their overhead, and I have seen this play out across the entire world, from Somalia to Afghanistan to Mali, and even in Iraq in 2003, the business community in Mosul expressed tremendous frustration and irritation with the amount of extortion on the part of the Maliki government-affiliated militias. And at first, in that critical juncture, thought that they were getting a better deal. And it's for that reason that we see this elite pact formed between the business community and Islamists at these critical junctures, and it results in a really extraordinary outcome on the battlefield. With that relationship, very quickly are they able to seize power. Very quickly are they able to bankrupt their rivals. You know, within 6 months in Somalia, a country that had been at war since 1991, within 6 months in 2006, the business community had decided that it was fed up with the warlord protection rackets, and in a very short amount of time pulled their money from the traditional tribal warlords that they had been paying security for, with that sort of relationship of point A to B to C to D, and decided we're going to invest in the Islamic courts instead. They took 90% of the countryside in 6 months. They bankrupted their rivals, and it's 70% of the business community changed its side. It was a remarkable outcome, and I've seen this pattern play out across cases.
So to back up this fascinating argument, you've assembled amazing empirical evidence, qualitative, quantitative, by traveling very wide and by conducting many high-risk interviews. Could you tell us a little about what some of the greatest challenges were that you encountered in doing fieldwork for your book?
So first and foremost, I mean, it looks like it's very risky or dangerous, but I have to tell you, I'm a tremendously risk-averse person when it comes to research and really anything. I think that, you know, we really need to think about fieldwork from the perspective of what is not just ethical, but what is tremendously respectful for the people who we are studying. And so, yes, my research looks at the relationship between Islamists and business elites who are sometimes selling things that we don't think are appropriate, you know, and that means that you're encountering people in parts of the world that are troubled and war affected. But I'm deeply passionate about research ethics, and for that reason, I never actually went anywhere where I wasn't a guest. I didn't talk to anyone unless I had been invited to do so. You know, sometimes people ask me questions like, did you have armed guards when you did your interview? And I thought, oh my goodness, can you imagine how rude that would be? You know, someone invites you to have tea with them and you show up with armed guards. No. So first and foremost, I only interviewed or spoke to anybody when I had an invitation to do so, when I was invited to do so. Also, it was really important to rely on trust-based networks. And so, for example, in Somalia, I don't have any familial or personal connections that would have made that particular field work really easy. And yet I had a professor from the University of Mogadishu who is extremely well respected in the Department of Economics and who definitely took me under his wing. And I think it's important for us to remember that in these places that have, a lot of turmoil and political upheaval, there are also local scholars who are doing incredible research. And so this wonderful professor from the University of Mogadishu introduced me not only to other scholars, but also to the entire business community that was operating in Mogadishu, because he was a professor of economics. And, it also established an element of transitive trust, between me, the interviewee, and also the professor. And that also adds an element of responsibility in that relationship. And so then it also became important to make sure that I asked the types of questions that were appropriate for these places. So I would never ask somebody something that would lead them to tell me something that would implicate them in such a way that could potentially harm them. So instead of asking someone something like, have you ever done X, Y, or Z? You can ask instead about what people under these, difficult circumstances could do, in terms of X, Y, and Z. And so you generalize your question in such a way that allows the person to speak as an expert, as opposed to speaking in such a way that is deeply about their own experience. And so there are a number of ways, both in terms of gaining access to the research subjects, but then also in how I approached and engaged with my research subjects in a way that made it a much less risky, type of research. And in fact, I dedicated 35 pages of my book in the appendix just to talking about research ethics, because I think it's important for us as scholars to make sure that if we're going to do security research in these places, that we really understand that, we're going to someone's home. And most people, even in the most troubled places, are incredibly hospitable to us when we go to their home. And so it's important for us to approach these places as a guest, and there's a responsibility of the guest, in receiving that hospitality.
You and I are both scholars of religion and extremism, and I know that you do, and I know that I do, often struggle with the kind of violence, sometimes even horrific violence, that we have to write about, and that is conducted by the people who we study. So how do you maintain both safety and objectivity when you come face to face with actors whose views and actions you strongly disapprove of, to say the least? What kind of advice would you have for maybe young scholars who are extremely excited about your book and want to follow in your footsteps and want to do this kind of work?
Okay, well, first and foremost, read the methodological appendix, because there are so many mistakes that you can make. And you know what? I'm hard on my own students as well. I mean, when my students come to me and they say they want to do certain types of challenging field work, I make sure that they understand entirely the ethical obligations upon them in doing that work, and the personal strain that is added in doing that kind of work as well. The first bit of advice I would say is that your research ethics board is not a hoop you have to jump through, and it is not your enemy that you have to somehow navigate around. It is a process that should inform how you understand the way you can ask questions that will make you a better scholar. And so think about having a cooperative, healthy relationship with your research ethics board in such a way that you can allow that process to instruct you in thinking critically about how you go about your business in someone else's home.
Tell our audience in two sentences what a research ethics board is.
Absolutely. And so before any scholars conduct research that involves human subjects, we need to put forward our proposal for our research design, acknowledging and taking responsibility for the safety of all of our research subjects, as well as the type of confidentiality and protocols that we're going to take to make sure that they're safe. And so sometimes I think students can feel like, oh, well, the research ethics board is going to hold me back from doing something. That's not the way to think about it. You need to think about how the research ethics board is teaching you how to do your work in a way that is most respectful. But you're absolutely right that there are times we're going to encounter people who are, that push all of our buttons, these are not people with whom we would associate in any other context. And so there have been moments where I've left certain interviewees a little shaken from the inside, And so I think it's important, first and foremost, in the moment of the interview, when you are actually speaking to the person, if, to the extent that it is possible, I must always come from a place of empathy, because if I cannot do that, I will probably be unable to extract any valuable information from that experience. I will probably not be able to hear what I need to hear from them. And so in the moment of the interview, even if, I have to say, as a Muslim Canadian feminist, there have been moments where the interviewees who I've had to talk to are not folks who I would otherwise have interacted with. And, that's not, it's not emotionally always what you'd imagine a safe place for you to be. But if I can't find a way to connect to the person who I'm talking to, and in that moment try to see how are you understanding the world from your eyes, then I'm not going to be able to bring forward the information that I need from them. I'm not going to be able to invite them into a conversation. So before I go into an interview, I always try to think of, okay, if I had walked through your life, if I had been you, if I had gone through the experiences that you had gone through, I could be on the other side of that conversation. And so that's the first starting point. I don't go into any kind of interview in a combative way. In a way in which I show up with all of my prejudgments and assumptions. That said, there have been times where I've left an interview, feeling like I need to debrief from that, because the stuff that person just told me was wrought with misogyny or anti-Semitism or, or I had left an interview with someone who exchanged arms for toxic waste dumping. And that's also, it's emotionally challenging. And so I think that as we do work in these places, there's also a real importance in being mindful of, the mental health process of making sure that you debrief afterwards to recenter in your values, because that exercise of empathy, while really important for the research process, has a closure at the end of that, and then you need to pull back into your own set of values and then be able to critically look at what just happened.
Excellent. Let's talk a little about religion, which is something you and I are very interested in. So start by sharing with the audience what role religion plays in your argument.
So, just because I have a political economy explanation, it doesn't mean I dismiss the importance of religion. In fact, religion has an incredible importance here. First, it's the only reason that the Islamists can sell security across these ethnic and tribal divisions is because they're tapping into a cross-cutting identity. They're able to tap into something that works across the parochial, local politics. And that's something that as an international community, we have a really hard time competing with. For example, in a place like Afghanistan, where there isn't a very strong sense of a national identity, instead there's, your Pashtun or your Tajik or your Uzbek, what does it really mean to be Afghan? I mean, the literature on imagined communities, Benedict Anderson's classic work about what is a nation, what is nationalism. Islamists have the ability to tap into a type of religious nationalism, which has a lot of traction in a part of the world where, cross-cutting identities are few and far between. But also, there is sort of an additional value that Islam brings to the table when it comes to these war economies. And that is, I'll tell you a little anecdote about a business person in Somalia who said, look, there's no law and order. There's no government to enforce contracts. So how do I know if I'm making a deal with you and you're from a rival community, a rival tribe, that you're not just going to run off with the loot, right? But if a person has a very religious demeanor, if they look like they pray 5 times a day, they've got the prayer beads in their hands, they're dressed according to their, cultural, religious dress, they appear to be a pious person, then that means they're signaling to the world that they are in fact held to a higher authority, that they, if they have this belief in the hereafter that they're maybe less likely to run off with the loot. And so, in fact, this becomes an information shortcut. And so if the gentleman in Somalia told me, look, if one person is smoking cigarettes and kicking back and looks like he's, not really mindful of his hereafter. And then the other person looks like they're very, very pious. Who are you going to buy from, right? Who's less likely to cheat you, right? And then in time, in these lawless societies, that actually starts to play a much more institutionalized role, where that information shortcut becomes a way of managing insecurity, where Islam actually becomes a way of reducing the uncertainty in the markets. So one of the biggest telecommunications firms, because yes, there were telecommunications firms, but no government in Somalia. So you can get a cell phone and cell phone plan, but even though there was no government, the private sector fills all of the space where the state pulls back. And you know, that telecommunications firm at one point needed to hire a whole bunch of people to work in their company. And one of the heads of the biggest business schools in Mogadishu told me that his star student didn't get a job. And so the business school dean went to the telecom guy, because they knew each other, and he said, "Why didn't you hire my best student?" And he said, "Well, he failed half his exam, which was on Islamic studies." And he said, "Well, why do you have half your exam on Islamic studies?" And he said, "Well, because we can teach the technical parts that the student may get wrong, but we can't put the trustworthiness in a student's heart." And so in the absence of the state, they needed to figure out who had that trustworthiness in their heart. And they used Islam as this sort of metric of making sure that the individual would police themselves. And so religion fills a space in the absence of a formal rule of law. Religion starts to fill a space, in Islam particularly, because it comes with a seemingly ready-made legal system, even though it's a very amorphous legal system. It signals a whole bunch of beliefs about economic trustworthiness. And so in the absence of a state, religion fills these spaces and allows people to make the sorts of leaps of faith that they need to in order for society to continue to function. And that also sets Islamists up in a really interesting way to be able to come and tap into that goodwill at those critical junctures.
So that's a very interesting way of thinking about religion interacting with violence and disorder and the marketplace. Is there something uniquely Muslim about this mechanism? Does it depend on particularities of Sharia or local Muslim custom or local Muslim history? Or might we expect to see similar mechanisms at place in other parts of the world, either where another religious movement is at play, or maybe there is some secular equivalent that can play this sort of coordinating role? Do you have a hunch about that?
So what I will say about Islam that has some of the unique features is that Islam is much more legalistic than other religious traditions. Not all of them. I mean, Judaism has a legalistic tradition. Christianity may be less so on the spectrum than Islam. And in that sense, it is sort of a comfortable fallback, in the event that the state, the rule of law falls in the state, that there is a rule of law that exists in society that is a common language of a rule of law. And so you can fall back onto those sort of legal institutions. Sharia courts, crop up in places where formal courts don't take place. And that is both in Somalia, in the absence of a state, there were still Sharia courts, which led to the rise of the Islamic Courts Union. In Swat province in Pakistan, where the formal courts were failing to provide justice, local administrations start to fill that space. And so we see that Islam does provide certain order-making capabilities that are not common across all religions. But that said, I do think that in places where a cross-cutting identity that is a secular national identity is absent, this is the kind of a phenomenon where if we all have one set of religious identity, but are divided along ethnic or tribal lines, that provides a sort of social glue and can be leveraged across cases. I think less so with secularism. Is there a comparison with, a communist phenomenon? It would definitely be a different kind of mechanism, because in that sense you would try to be you need to once again reimagine the narrative. And one of the things about religion is you've got a historical narrative and also a prophetic narrative of the future, that has deeper roots than communism. And in fact, in many parts of the world, the pushback against communism was because it had a foreignness to it. It was something that was coming from another part of the world as opposed to being organically, traditionally from the local communities. And so that's another reason why religion, which has deeper roots, has that kind of traction, where you can turn around and say, well, we're going back to our identity as opposed to importing something from the outside.
So on the topic of the collapse of the state and what happens when the state collapses, you make reference in your work to Charles Tilley, who both you and I teach to our students.
Absolutely.
Who famously argued that war is a racket, and that war making and state making sort of go hand in hand. It's not merely states that make war, but also war that allows states to form because of this racket mechanism. But your argument is different in important ways. Tell us what your relationship is, your argument's relationship to traditional ways in which scholars envision state collapse and state formation.
So what's remarkable about Charles Tilley's research is he explains the emergence of the modern state that took place in a time that we can't really repeat now, So state making in the Tilleyan model was, princely states fighting against other princely states that eventually formed, what became our present day European states. But this was a very bloody process, where borders were, redefined through warfare, where states had to, consolidate their power to survive. That type of order making doesn't exist today because we have the international laws that prevent annexation, territorial, claims against other states. We don't absorb other countries, and so since 1945, with the prohibition on interstate war, of a territorial acquisition, where sovereignty of the state became inviolable, we have had the emergence of these sort of weak states that whose sovereignty is preserved. And the types of wars that we've seen since then have led, in many cases, to state failure. And so the argument has been that, well, war in these places actually doesn't make the state. It makes state failure, and that internal collapse of the state doesn't have this long-term order-making outcome. Instead of Charles Tilley's war makes the state and the state makes war, we see war as this a never-ending vortex of chaos that leads to greater futility, and yet the state remains something that we legally recognize. So Somalia, even though it didn't have a government for 20 years, it didn't matter that it was still a sovereign state, even though it met none of the criteria for statehood. And Will Reno's work that essentially identified that type of warfare being rapacious, that internal predation between warlord and subject not resulting in that outcome. And yet Tilley's model does actually speak to this type of order making, because he is right that the relationship between ruler and subject in this way, this protection racket relationship, does exist in these conflict zones. But what these conflict zones are they are competitive environments for security provision. They are essentially protection rackets in competition with each other. And what I'm arguing in this book is that Islamists have found a particular way to monopolize that security market. And so that has led to a type of order making in which what is a monopoly on security, a monopoly on the use of force in the context of a state? That's the Weberian definition of statehood. And so civil wars are a competitive environment for protection rackets, and monopolizing security is in fact that state formation process. We've seen Islamists do it, but I don't think that they're the only ones who can. At the end of the day, that mechanism between the warlord and the subject, the business community and their ethnic warlord, or the business community and their Islamist, that was not the interests of the business community have always been pragmatic, of the citizen have been pragmatic in wanting a security monopoly. The business community wants, and the citizen wants, to be able to pay taxes to one person and provide security for themselves in exchange for those taxes. That's what we all do here in our countries, is have a simplified model for protection in that regard. So in these environments, just because Islamists have found a mechanism to monopolize, that doesn't mean that the interest for having a security monopoly is exclusive to Islamists. I think there are certain things that the international community has done in promoting order in these places that hasn't actually led to the outcome of state consolidation and state formation that we can think critically about. Because while my book points to the advantages that Islamists have in this game, I also don't think that Islamists are the only ones who are capable of building order in these places.
So that's a great transition to my next question.
Great.
Policy implications. So let's assume your book lands in the Oval Office, maybe not this Oval Office, maybe the next Oval Office.
I was going to say,
and a president who is well-read picks up your book and wants to learn something from it. So not necessarily the United States, but what might the world community learn from your book about either introducing order into failed states, or if that's what they happen to be interested in, combating jihadist movements?
So, the first part of your question about which president would pick this up, I do have to say the logic of this book is very much about the art of the deal, And so let us hope that all are open to this understanding, because frankly, if the story of these jihadist groups is that it is all ideology and all identity politics, then it's way harder to fix. And so it's a huge relief to have uncovered this process that identifies some pretty important rational economic explanations for their success, because we actually know a whole lot about how to play this game, in the sense that we understand the rationality of the market. We understand the impetus to lower taxes and to make a business environment more competitive. It's not foreign to those of us in the international community, policymakers here in the United States or in Canada, where I'm from, or elsewhere, that high levels of taxation and regulation are going to irritate a whole lot of people. And so some of the great things that we can glean out of this immediately is some critical reflection on how our own initiatives in these parts of the world have undermined that competition. We often look at problems of corruption as though they're somehow like secondary or tertiary consequences of intervention that are like, okay, well, we've got to secure the environment, and then there's a level of corruption that happens, and I guess we just have to tolerate it. Corruption is actually a driving force in creating the security problems that we are trying to solve. And so, for example, if the governments that we are propping up in parts of the world where jihadist groups are trying to take back power are in fact setting up militia checkpoints, extorting their population, creating a frustrating or hostile environment for this business class, that's not a secondary consequence. That is going to become a key driver in causing people to rechannel their support back to Islamists. In fact, there was some survey research that came out of Afghanistan as early as 2010 that showed that one of the key drivers of support for the Taliban was a perception of high levels of government corruption affecting an individual's own life. And so we have to re-understand how corruption actually plays a very important role in shaping the security environment in these places. And so we have some agency in not just opposing enemies, but also thinking about who our friends are, And so if we have allies on the ground who are engaging in high levels of predation or corruption on local populations, that's a place to actually, revisit those relationships and have some pretty frank conversations with those partners who we work with overseas about appropriate kinds of behavior. And secondly, what I think is really important is realizing that there are very vibrant and dynamic business actors in these places who are interested in competing and who understand competition well. And so creating legitimate, legal, appropriate, potentially prosperous industries gives people an incentive to buy into a political process. That's the kind of thing where we think development, we tack that on to security. Absolutely not. I mean, I remember having a conversation with a bunch of farmers in rural Kandahar province who had fought against the Taliban and who were who had joined on side with the Americans, with NATO, fought the Taliban, and were being disarmed, demobilized, and reintegrated. And yet they had no economic options other than to grow opium. And the pushback against opium production, which was, eradication of poppy fields, was affecting their livelihoods. And there were no alternatives that were being presented to them that were viable. And so they said to me very openly in a DDR facility for disarming militiamen that they were going to retake up arms and fight against the Americans because of this. That's a problem that it's not a secondary consequence, it's primary. And I'll finish with one last very important anecdote about this. I gave a talk at the Canadian War Museum, and one of the members of our armed forces wrote to me thereafter about her time on a provincial reconstruction team in Kandahar, and she said that she knew a man who, as he would come into Panjwai, the Afghan National Security Forces would take his melons, and then as he would leave Panjwai with whatever little he had earned, they would take his money, and that he now grows opium for the Taliban, and that, this research has helped her understand the phenomenon that she witnessed on the ground. And that is an area in which we tend not to dedicate enough attention. We think of corruption, we think of development as secondary issues as opposed to primary issues when it comes to security, and that's a mistake.
So while you and I have been talking, we've been collecting some questions from the audience. I'm now going to bring some of those questions into the conversation. A member of the audience asks, mass media tends to portray the root causes of the proliferation of terrorism as religious or ideological. Should your research be used to contradict these preconceptions in the media?
So, it's not to say that the people who are involved in terrorism are not ideologically motivated. What's interesting, though, is why they're able to succeed in parts of the world where, chaos is reigned, and why are they able to create order in parts of the world that are disordered. Let's take a look at Iraq, for example, which has been at war since 2003, as of course everyone knows. And ISIS was the latest incarnation of several jihadist groups. It had its roots in Al Qaeda in Iraq, and yet. Why were they able to create state-like power in a part of the world where the international community had dumped billions of dollars trying to create order? And, if it was just a question of raw dollar amount, frankly, that war should have been won a long time ago. But what happened in Mosul in 2013 was, a failure to realize that the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad had, allowed its associated militias to be extorting people, the business class in Mosul that was looking for a simplified solution to its problem. And so why was Daesh able to finance a very rapid blitz? It had established a relationship with that underground economy, with the smugglers, that gave it the resources to do what it wished it could do on the ground. And so it's not a question of whether or not jihadists are ideological, but why it is that they're able to succeed in parts of the world where, frankly, at the end of the day, You cannot win a war unless you have the resources to move your troops forward. And those resources are coming from the local economy for very practical reasons. And that understanding that relationship helps explain why they're doing well. Frankly, it's not to say that ideology doesn't matter, but ideology alone doesn't explain why they're doing well. It only explains why they exist, but they're only capable of what they have done because they have managed to secure these sorts of assets.
Several members of the audience want your help in envisioning how this story ends. So, is this an ephemeral state of affairs as ISIS, Daesh, it loses territory? Is it able to perpetuate these practices?
This is a great question. So first thing is every time in every case, the business class, after having thought that it was reducing its costs, realizes that it bought a lemon and it's too late. Because think about it this way. I hate to malign Walmart, but, imagine when the mom and pop shop, all of them get sort of put out of business because Walmart shows up. And then if Walmart increases its prices, there's nothing you can do because there's no competition left, right? And so in the same way that the Islamists take control, they push out all of their rivals, and then the next thing you know, they can do whatever the heck they want to you. And it's usually stuff that the business community didn't anticipate and didn't want. And so people in Mosul, while they were annoyed with the Maliki government's militias, boy, were they pissed off when they realized how much Daesh was going to tax the daylights out of them afterwards. And so usually these relationships sour, so there's this moment where they realize, oh my God, it's a trap, I'm stuck. And, but now there's nothing they can do. They create a leviathan. They create a state that has the capability to repress them and to extract that which it wills from them. And so usually that relationship itself shifts from being one in which the local population thinks that it's finding a solution to realizing that they now have a very coercive relationship. So once that happens, there is a souring. And you are absolutely right that they also lose power and capabilities when the international community pushes back. But they also know how to stay in the game for a long time. So we're looking at Daesh losing territory in Iraq right now. Daesh knew that it was going to lose territory on the day that it had seized territory. I mean, they knew that they were going to lose Mosul as early as 2014. And so they have, in fact, been preparing for this, and we have seen this across cases. I have a new paper, in fact, building off of my book, which actually talks about jihadist durability and why these groups are able to stay around for the long haul, even though they lose territory and resources in this way. Because what they do is once they're pushed back, they stop acting like proto-states. They stop governing and holding territory and taxing and monopolizing control, and they tighten their belts. And then what they do is they shift to insurgency, and that's a low-cost game that you can play for a very long time. And as they tighten their belts and look to the long horizon, they can engage in hit-and-run attacks, small-scale warfare, and maintain a type of relevance on the battlefield, engaging in very bloody attacks but don't require the same type of institutional power. And then in having done so, they actually, in the Iraqi case, Daesh immediately started moving its resources. My colleague Renat Mansour, who tracks Daesh financing, told me that their money laundering activities have skyrocketed over the past year, in which they take their cash resources and they put them into front operations and other businesses so that they can maintain their revenue for that long haul during the insurgency stage, waiting for the next opportunity to open up so that they can reclaim power. We actually saw this happen in Somalia, where al-Shabaab had territory across the south. They were making tens of millions of dollars off of Kismayo port. And then when the Kenyans pushed them out of Kismayo port, They sort of let go of a lot of their territorial holdings, moved into the periphery. They don't hold any cities right now, but they hold back into the countryside, are engaged primarily in hit-and-run attacks. Immediately after losing Kismayo Port, we saw the attack on Westgate Mall in Kenya, and then Garissa University. Low cost, high casualties, very bloody, but that's because they don't have the capabilities of paying for their foot soldiers in the same way. They don't act like an army, they start acting like an insurgency, but they stay in the game. Now, whether or not they can reclaim power by establishing that relationship with the business class once again, I did say, most of the time people feel like they've bought a lemon, and so no one is happy with them anymore. But that's where the corruption thing is really important. If what we offer is worse than the alternative that the Islamists offer, then we force local populations to choose between two bad options, and we have to be more mindful about whether or not we are offering bad, if our option is in fact worse than the option that the Islamists are putting forward.
So about the lemon, so this you present this as a business calculation. How much taxes will I have to pay? How many middlemen can I cut out of the equation? How much more product will I be able to get to the market? And you imply that the moment of recognition, oh no, I've bought a lemon, is the tax is actually higher than I thought. But in a sense, there's a much more serious lemon buying going on because you also have to live under this regime. Not only do business, you have to live with the moral, ethical, legal environment that this regime creates. You have to live with the state of authoritarian terror that this regime puts citizens under. Are business people not aware that buying the lemon involves buying into life under a jihadi terror organization?
So first and foremost, if everybody had foresight, no one would have credit card debt, right? We often make suboptimal decisions as a species, right? That said, think about where they emerge. Jihadist groups do not succeed in places where there is law and order and stability and human rights. I mean, they take root in places where it sucks. If we think about the Taliban in 1994 in Afghanistan, I had a conversation with Mullah Zaif, who was involved in the early Taliban movement and left it, and he's written a book called My Life with the Taliban. And he actually told me about this historical myth about the rise of the Taliban movement. So the popular narrative that existed in 1994, as told in various different variations, was that when the Taliban first emerged, it was in response to a horrific incident that was in fact very commonplace at the time. In 94, Afghanistan was in a state of brutal civil war along ethnic lines. Genocidal campaigns between Pashtun, Tajik, Uzbek militias, Hazaras were being butchered. And even within ethnic groups, violence within tribal communities, among tribal communities. And as the story goes, as the legend goes, there was a young girl from Mullah Omar's village who had been kidnapped by a local commander and was being held at his base and gang raped. And the villagers were distraught and went to Mullah Omar and said, "You are supposed to be a pious leader, and here our girls are being molested and you are doing nothing." And so Mullah Omar rallied his students, his talibs, which is Taliban, the plural, and with 16 rifles among them, stormed the base, killed the commander, freed the girl, took his body, hung him by the barrel of a tank, and paraded him through the streets for all to see that this is what will happen to you if you molest the girls of our communities. Now, Mullah Zaif told me that this is, in fact, the real story is much more mundane. In reality, they did not succeed in freeing the girl. They found her body and her remains, sometime later, brutally mangled. The commander was killed in some later skirmish, but not hung by a barrel of a tank and paraded through the streets. And so the story, in fact, was much more ordinary. The reality was much more ordinary. But why did that story catch? Why did people need to believe that? It wasn't because they saw the Taliban at that time as a jihadist group that was going to oppress them. They saw them as the heroes and saviors who were going to liberate them from the rapacious commanders of the civil war who were terrorizing them. So then, in that moment, they were seen as a solution, not as a problem. And so, do people have foresight in that moment that what they're creating is worse than the circumstances that they're in? We really need to think about the circumstances that they're in to understand why it is they may, in fact, see this as a solution as opposed to a problem. Same in Somalia, There was another story about a kidnapped school kid, and then Sheikh Sharif went and got the Islamic courts to secure his release, and then people feel that moment of, we're going to take charge of our circumstances, And yes, after the fact, I got to tell you that there were some business people, like multimillionaires, and I got to tell you, the business people who I've talked to they're not small potatoes. Like, these are people who have, mansions and estates and chandeliers. It's really, there's a lot of money to be made in a conflict zone. And, one of the guys who was a big cigarette dealer in Somalia, who made his business off of cigarettes, funded the Islamists thinking that, okay, this is going to solve our security problem, and then they banned cigarettes in the country. And he was like, oh, shucks, like, that's all my money gone right there. But in that moment of decision making, you were not comparing the Islamists to, a functioning, democratic, government that's protecting the rule of law and human rights. We're comparing them to ethnogenocidal militias who are raping and extorting local populations. And so that's why I'm saying that, once again, corruption, and I'm not just talking about rent-seeking corruption. There's also like the human rights abuse type of corruption that we need to think about. Corruption is a huge driver in decision-making. If the alternative is worse, then you know what? Next to them, the Islamists start to look pretty good, in those critical moments.
So I'm glad you mentioned cigarettes, because I was going to ask about drugs.
Right.
So it's clear now what the gains are for the business community and what the prices that the business community has to pay. It's clear what the gains are for the jihadists. What do the jihadists compromise? So how is there trade in poppy under a jihadist regime? How is there, and you describe it fascinatingly in your book, a trade in archaeological artifacts that they should be destroying rather than selling?
So this is great. So absolutely, there are these sorts of, hypocritical compromises that are being made. Absolutely, there's the question about whether or not, opium, you can't drink alcohol in Islam, right? And so opium, cocaine, these are like very, very haram industries. And so at what point when the Islamists say, okay, fine, we're going to keep letting you traffic them, what's the narrative involved in that? Now, there are times when they do, in fact, crack down on even those industries. So there have been bans on cigarettes, there have been bans on kots, which is a very popular narcotic in Somalia, which produced outrage. They've banned soccer and music. Opium, they stayed in the game until about 2000, and then they said, okay, well, fine, at one point in 2000, the Taliban did ban opium, and then 90% of the opium production in the country declined. And then there are the other years where it's like, okay, well, what about now when the Taliban are very actively involved in narco trafficking, where Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb are like the primary narcotics traffickers, in their zone, moving cocaine into Europe from Latin American cartels that traffic it into West Africa. So what's the very Islamic Sharia explanation for that? There are a few that are offered, but they're clearly being added instrumentally. This is clearly an instrumental explanation for, why they're doing such haram behavior, haram being un-Islamic behavior. One is that, okay, well, these are products that are going to the enemy's destination, and so they're not actually being consumed by our populations, and so therefore, if it's harming the enemy, then we somehow have got a loophole. around it. So the argument saying, okay, well, these are going to Western countries, and so it's not like we're consuming them here at home. And so if it's harming the enemy, then that's fine. That's one explanation. I've seen many others as well, in which the narcotics traffickers themselves do a whole bunch of other things to compensate for the fact that they are in fact trafficking narcotics. So if you're involved in opium production or cocaine trafficking, then you've got to do a whole bunch of Islamic charity to sort of disguise your bad behavior, and so you need to compensate for it by being extra pious and extra generous. And so a lot of the individuals who are involved in opium or even cocaine trafficking will be very charitable to their communities, and thus bolster their Islamic credentials by sort of Islam washing their bad behavior. But absolutely, it enters that thorny area where you see post hoc religious justifications for it, as well as a whole lot of compensation to try to make up for the fact that they know what they're doing is wrong.
So you're describing a sort of entrapment process, at least from the point of view of the residents and the business people, where they find themselves in what we'd call a sort of Pareto suboptimal situation, if only they'd known ahead of time. Have you seen communities extract themselves from this trap? How do things return back to normal when they do?
So Islamists are typically overthrown by international interventions, So if I think about the mechanisms that local communities try to negotiate with their Islamist leadership, that is not, can't actually think of a case in which the local community themselves was responsible for the complete dismantlement of a proto-state. I mean, since the Taliban, there is a tremendous intolerance for these types of polities in the world. I mean, the international community does not accept them, which actually speaks to a very important process that makes this different from Charles Tilly's model, in the sense that even if this is an endogenous process of order making, because once these proto-states exist, they're intolerant towards any sort of dissenting opinion, because you're arguing with Islam, right? And that's not allowed. And so they have a totalitarian character to them. And yet they have done something that is remarkable, in that they have monopolized force, and yet we do not accept these sorts of polities in our international community. And so we're stuck between this sort of rock and a hard place, in which order making is very difficult in these spaces, and this type of order making is not permissible. And so they can never actually achieve true statehood. They can never, but that's because we don't allow Ivan the Terribles anymore. That's not the way that order is created in the international system. We don't allow for hundreds of years of brutality against your own population and your neighbors in order to create self-sustaining states. And so what typically happens is the international community, and sometimes a little faster, in the Somali case, one can argue that it was a bit of a misstep, very quickly steps in to make sure that these polities don't have the ability to further consolidate their rule. And in the Somali case, in fact, that resulted in ever worse violence. The Islamic Courts Union in 2006 was not actually as extreme as, they banned cotton cigarettes, but this was not like the argument that this was the African Taliban was an exaggeration. This was a group that actually invited the international community to have an interaction with it and to come and see what we've accomplished. And because there was a fear of this sort of group, that the AMISOM mission, which overthrew the Islamic courts, the goal was to remove the Islamists, and instead it gave birth to al-Shabaab, which in fact was far more extreme and then became a formal al-Qaeda affiliate. And so in some of these interventions that have aimed at preventing jihadist insurgencies from taking more control, they actually made them worse, and that's something to be very mindful of.
Okay, so that's the negative response to my question. What's the positive response? So what's an uplifting, optimism-inspiring example of a community that manages to, either by its own volition or outside intervention, pull itself out? I'm asking because several members of the audience have proposed what would seem like a natural solution. That is strong central government. We should have supported the Baathists. We should throw our weight behind any central authoritarian regime that will crack down on this and eliminate it.
Well, okay, so I'm going to be positive about this, and but also to respond directly to whether or not to support a strong sovereign state, even if it's authoritarian. I think after the Libyan case, where overthrowing Gaddafi was supposed to, make Libya better, from a humanitarian perspective, turned out to be disastrous. I think that the lesson to be learned there is it's much easier to break a state than to make one. So hold your horses on these sorts of interventions. You often create this sort of chaos. But yes, there is absolutely hope, and my book is not a doom and gloom story, 100%. I think that first and foremost, people want this solution of a functioning state that isn't extreme. And that's something to always remember, is that these are not just parts of the world that are interested in, ideological extremism, political chaos, and illegality. People want, to thrive and do well, and I've spoken to arms dealers and people who are involved in other types of illicit industries. And one of our researchers actually spoke to an arms dealer in Somalia who said, look, if the peace comes tomorrow, I'll sell cars, And so there's a lot of hope in these places for change. And what I will say is that there are also examples of success when, in fact, we look at the corruption problem and deal with it appropriately. Right now, the Somali federal government, there's a moment of goodwill, a tremendous moment of goodwill. It's almost unprecedented. In the past year, there's a new president named Farmajo. That's his nickname. It's like the cheese president, because he loves cheese, okay? And he's popular, and he's seen as not being tied to Islamists or to a particular clan, and is working to rebuild a sense of Somali nationalism. And after the October 14th bombings, which were horrific, they're the ones that were next to the fuel tank that killed hundreds of people in Mogadishu, there was a remarkable moment in which one of my friends from Mogadishu told me that she had seen for the first time the Somali National Army in uniform digging people out of the rubble, and so the security force is actually working to serve the country itself. And what's really important to remember is that they haven't been paid in a while, and so we need to think about how do we make sure we're investing in and in supporting those moments of hope and optimism, because that's a remarkable moment where the Somali National Army is demonstrating that, unlike other men in uniform over the past 2 decades who have predated on society, they're there to actually provide for their own citizens. And that display of virtuous military service is a moment of hope in a country that's been torn apart by war, where you have a president that has popular legitimacy. Let's see how we can leverage that and support that, moving it towards a place of self-sustaining transition. We want to make sure that our resources are not, there was a potential threat of pulling resources away from the Somali federal government at this critical moment of emergence. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we're supporting those processes that are virtuous, and then using the stick only when, in fact, we realize that our local partners, some may be in Afghanistan, we maybe want to think about that one a little carefully, who might be ripping us off a little bit. And so thinking about it hopefully, I think that there are the greatest source of hope are the people who are living in these countries themselves, who stay in it for the long haul, working to transform their conditions, and who have in fact done extraordinary things, and that's what I think the book really does speak to is, even in places that we imagine are profoundly chaotic, there is not only survival, but people also learn how to build, how to grow. The fact that there is in fact wealth signals that there are people who know how to transform remarkably difficult circumstances into assets. And if we can leverage that towards peace, there's a lot of hope there.
On that note, this is all the time we have tonight. So on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I would like to invite all of you to join me in thanking Aisha Ahmad for this excellent discussion.